Good evening, everybody. This is Wes Moore. I hope you are having a good week. Thank you for joining this Facebook Live session. I want to especially greet our Knightsville Baptist family and, of course, all the visitors and guests that are joining us tonight. All right, so let's get into our discussion tonight. We want to talk about the stimulus, the national debt, and God's judgment upon America. We want to jump into this issue of the stimulus and use it as a way to get into some other topics as well. So everybody knows, I'm sure you've seen the word of the stimulus that was passed. I believe it was last week. We're going to talk in detail about it, but it's made a lot of news. And I think the checks are supposed to go out sometime in the next week or two for the stimulus. We want to look at this from a biblical framework. We want to look at the economics of this. I want to teach you some things tonight about the stimulus, about economics, and about the Bible that might help you filter and understand what's going on a little bit better. So that's sort of what we want to do. We want to take this issue of the stimulus and we want to springboard and talk about debt. We're going to talk about the national debt, how big it is, what a problem it is, and what's going to happen if we don't do something about it. And then we want to use that to roll into God's judgment, God's discipline, God's punishment, if you will, of the nation through all of the things that we are seeing now. So let's talk about a couple of verses that are going to shape our discussion. The first is from Proverbs 22:7. Which says the borrower is servant or slave to the lender. The borrower is servant or slave to the lender. And this is what we'll use in the first part of our discussion tonight. This text, as we look into the debt that the United States has accumulated and is accumulating as we speak. And we're going to learn and we're going to see that the Bible is right, that eventually, when you borrow too much money, you become the slave of your debt. So we want to look at that. And then we want to step back and get the bigger picture with a verse like this from Jeremiah 48. Jeremiah said, "Since you trust in your deeds and riches, you too will be taken captive. So my heart laments for Moab like a flute. The wealth they acquired is gone." So those are the two verses that we're going to use to frame our discussion tonight. We'll get into this first Proverbs 22 text first. Let's ask a question here. What is an economic stimulus? What is an economic stimulus? Well, the first thing that we need to do to understand what an economic stimulus is to understand what an economy is. What is, when we use the word economy, what are we talking about? The word economy simply means the total of goods and services made by a nation in a given year. It's basically what we make and sell in a year as a nation. That's our economy. And it's one way, a very good way, in fact, to measure our wealth as a nation. Because whatever you make, you're going to sell, and when you sell it, you're going to be paid for it, and that money is going to come to you in the form of income or wealth. So a term that we use a lot in economics is gross domestic product. The gross domestic product, or GDP. So let me just lay this out for you here. Gross simply means the total. The total. It doesn't mean like nasty or yucky. It means the total. The total domestic as opposed to foreign. So the total domestic product. The products that we make, services, those kinds of things in our nation. That's the gross domestic product, the total. And when we talk about the economy, when we make more and we buy more, that's good. That's what we call economic growth. We're making more and we're buying more. When we're making less and buying less, this is considered not good. This is we hear the word recession, and recession and depression have definitions. There are a certain number of quarters where the economy is getting smaller, and I forget the number now, but a certain number of quarters of economic slowdown is called a recession. If it continues on for more quarters, it reaches the point of depression. So there are actual definitions, economic definitions to those two ideas. So an economic stimulus is just a set of actions by the government, typically the federal government, to get the economy moving, to cause it to improve, to take it from producing less and buying less to producing more and buying more. And there are several things that the federal government will do when it's trying to improve or stimulate the economy. The first thing they'll do is put cash into the market. They'll send out checks like they're doing now to individuals so that they will then in turn spend that money, which will cause people who are making stuff to make more of it. That's the idea behind it, with cash, direct cash. The second thing, and we'll see this a little bit later as we talk more about the stimulus that we're seeing now, is loans. The government will make low interest loans available to businesses, organizations, to help keep them going, to give them the money to buy equipment, to open new offices, to pay employees. They'll try and stimulate, push the economy along by giving loans. And then finally, policy. In other words, the rules. The government will change the rules for starting a business, tax rules, paperwork rules, red tape rules, all kinds of different rules that the government can change to help move the economy along. And the goal, of course, is to get people spending and businesses producing. So the idea of a stimulus is not a bad idea in and of itself, but in certain contexts it is bad, and I want to try and show you what some of those might be here. Two problems that I want to mention with the stimulus now, with a stimulus now. One has to do with this present stimulus, and the other has to do with stimulus or stimuli in general. Why are they a bad idea for the United States long term? The first, we'll look at the short term. The first problem with the stimulus is that money is not the problem. So when we look at cash into the economy, when we look at loans into the economy, we look at reducing regulations, which also reduce costs for businesses. It's all about money, giving people more money to spend, businesses more money to invest. But the problem right now is, in our situation right here today, is that money is not the problem. The problem with the economy right now is fear. And of course the fact that the government has shut down the entire economy. But that too is from fear. Fear. And one of the terms, another economics term that you probably have heard, but it has a lot to do with what we're seeing today, is called consumer confidence. Now, consumer confidence is really just how optimistic people are about the future economically. So if they expect their wages are going to be up, their jobs are secure, that they've going to have plenty of money, and they will spend more, they have more confidence, they're more optimistic. This is also true on the business side. Businesses are looking forward to seeing if things are going to be better, and therefore they will make more, and so on. So how optimistic we are has a lot to do with how much money we spend and how much we make. And the problem now is that fear has taken hold of us. So it really doesn't matter how much money you put in, it doesn't matter how much money you loan, if we're all scared to death, which I talked about last week, a lot of the things that the media does to scare us, then we're obviously not going to spend anything. So the stimulus, while good in concept and idea, is not going to really help us. What is your level of optimism right now? Ask yourself that question, and then you will see why putting some more money in your pocket may not do anything to help the economy. But the second problem with stimulus or stimuli in general is, in the United States of America, is that they add to our already overwhelming, monstrous national debt. Because we have to get this money from somewhere. Debt, deficits. Let's go back and talk about a few economics terms here. What is a deficit and what is a national debt? So the government, let's talk about deficit first. The government takes in a certain amount of money. I'm going to look in just a minute at the 2019 intake of the federal government and its spending. But the government brings in money, just like you make money, they bring in money in terms of, generally through tax revenue. And that's what they take in. But then what they spend is a different thing altogether. The difference between what they spend and what they make, assuming that they spend more than they make, is called a deficit. And a deficit is just how much you're in the hole. If you make $1,000 a month and you spend $1,200 a month and you're $200 in the hole, your deficit is $200. That accumulation of those yearly deficits is the national debt. So the deficit is a yearly thing about how much we're short, but when you pile up all those yearly shortages, you end up with a total debt. So the deficit is how much we go in the hole each year, and the national debt is the accumulation of all those deficits over the course of many years. How far in debt are we? The question. Let's get into this now and look at this. This is staggering. The overall national debt, today it is $24 trillion right now as we sit here and talk. That's 24,000 billion in the hole, if you can even get your mind around that amount of money. So that's where we are right now as we look at spending more on a stimulus, taking more money and spending it to try and stimulate the economy. This is what the present stimulus looks like, as well as some other factors. First of all, there's $2 trillion in direct spending. Remember that cash portion that I showed you earlier. That cash portion. $2 trillion we're going to be sending out in checks. And then there's something they're calling liquidity, which essentially means loans. Up to $4 trillion in loans. So it's interesting, I was talking to a customer of mine, a small business owner, yesterday, and he told me something about this loan program here. One of the things, I had put this in parentheses here before I had even talked to him, because I always wonder, when the government loans money to someone, are they really paying it back? So I was talking to him. He's a small business owner, and he said the part of the stimulus working through the Small Business Administration is to make loans to small businesses to cover the cost of their employees' labor, their hourly wages, their 401k, their benefits, their health insurance, all of that for up to 8 weeks, which sounds great, but here's the kicker. If the small business keeps those employees for the entire 8 weeks, guess what? They don't have to pay the money back. So you have to be careful about the terms that politicians use when you're evaluating how much money we're spending, because most of these loans, I take it, are not going to be paid back at all. So that's just more spending. And then there's some more talk even now about more stimulus, infrastructure stimulus, and other things like that. So $2 trillion to $8 trillion more debt in this stimulus round on its own. And you have to add to that the $1.1 trillion that we're already expected to be in the hole just from our regular budget. So when you add all of that up, you end up with $27 to $33 trillion in debt by the end of the year. Now here's an interesting thing. I went back and looked this up. Do you know how long it took the United States of America to get, let's just look at the average there, it's really 3 to 9 trillion, somewhere in the middle. Let's say 6 trillion is what we're going to spend. Let's just say some of the loans are paid back. 6 trillion. Do you know how long it took us to get $6 trillion in the hole as a nation? It took 200 years. So we are going to add 200 years worth of debt to our nation in the next 9 months. That's how big the national debt is. Let's briefly look at this. I thought you'd find this interesting. What the government brought in. This is the income, not the spending of the government in 2019, which I think their fiscal year just means finance year. I think it runs October the 1st to September the 30th, so it's not calendar year. But at any rate, you can see here income taxes were 1.72 trillion. All this is in trillions. About 50% of the income of the nation, of the government, was through income taxes, personal income tax. Then you have Social Security down here on the bottom left, 1.24 trillion. That's 36%. Those are also called payroll taxes, and those are used to finance Social Security and Medicare. And we're going to look at that in the next slide. Then corporate taxes, about 6%, and then other types of income, about 8%. So that's how the government brought in money. And the interesting thing is, we still borrowed. We brought in $3.5 trillion, and we still borrowed $1 trillion to make up for what we went over. That's 22%. So that means 22% of every dollar the U.S. government spent in 2019 was borrowed from someone else, whether it be taxpayers, individuals like you and me in our 401ks, governments like Japan, China, and so on, Germany, other nations put money into buy our bonds and our debt as well. One of the things that I wanted to clear up, because I know we have a lot of seniors watching tonight, is the whole issue of Social Security and Medicare. One of the things that everybody sort of thinks, and it makes sense until you get into the nuts and bolts of it, is that there's some kind of a Social Security fund that's sitting out there in a bank somewhere, that when you get your Social Security check every month, you're just kind of drawing it down. You have put that money in the past, and now it's just drawing down. Well, there's two things I want to point out to you about your Social Security. First of all, it's not 100% money that you put in. Your employers have been putting in as you've been putting in. Roughly half of that money is from your employer. And then secondly, there is no fund for Social Security. That money doesn't exist. It's not in a bank somewhere. Let's look at this. We talked about this a moment ago. This means Social Security and Medicare taxes. These are the taxes that come out of paychecks. If you look at your FICA and those other types of taxes, those are actually going into to pay Social Security. So we took in $1.24 trillion in 2019 in Social Security and Medicare, those taxes. But guess what we spent on Social Security and Medicare? $1.65 trillion. So we are in the hole. We have a deficit in Social Security and Medicare of $410 billion last year, or 25%. So that means that every dollar that you got in your Social Security check, and I'm not beating you up for taking the Social Security, I'm just trying to help you understand what the realities are. 25% of every dollar that you received was borrowed. Every time you used Medicare to pay for some health issue or health problem, 25% of that was borrowed. The fact of the matter is, there is no Social Security fund. All that money's been spent. So when you were putting that money in years ago, the government was taking it in one hand and putting it out in another. Taking it in one hand and putting it out another. But the problem now is there are more seniors, that baby boom that we always hear about. There are more seniors now and fewer taxpayers, so we're in the hole. So I just want you to know that. Again, I'm not criticizing you for taking it. I'm just letting you know what is going on. Now let me help you see. I've been struggling for years now to figure out a way to help you see. The numbers are so staggering. We talk about 24 trillion, 24,000 billion. It's difficult for us to put that in perspective. How much debt is that compared to what the government takes in a year? So what I've done is I've created this character. We're going to call him Sammy Spender. Sammy Spender, Uncle Sam. This is Uncle Sam's son. Sammy Spender. And we're going to take an individual and give him the same kind of financial picture that the federal government has right now with its income and its debt. So let's look at that. Let's look at the federal government as an individual. Sammy Spender. Okay. First of all, Sammy has a good income. Sammy makes $100,000 a year. That is a great income. All right? So you think he shouldn't have any trouble. He's so rich, he shouldn't have any financial issues. But look at this. This is Sammy's debt. $857,000. If the federal government was an individual making $100,000 a year, the debt of that individual will be $857,000. But this gets better. Not only is it that large, Sammy spends $9,600 a year in interest, but he doesn't pay any principal. So he's paying $10,000 a year to his credit card, his mortgage, his car payment, interest, but he's not paying a single thing off in principal. The debt amount is still there. He borrows an average of $24,000 a year, every year. So not only is he $857,000 in the hole, but he's going to be $857,000 plus $24,000 the next year, and the next year, and the next year. He has no savings whatsoever. Remember what I told you about the government. There is no Social Security fund. All the money's been spent. All we have in our pocket is debt. And not only this, remember the federal government now is making these loans, many of which we know will not be paid back based on the very criteria that they give. He is loaning out $110,000 to his friends right now. How in the world can he do this? So let me ask you a question. You think about this guy's, you think about Sammy's financial picture. If this was your son, your friend, someone you were advising, what is going to happen to Sammy? Where is this all going to end? You know where it's going to end. Sammy's going to go broke. Sammy's going to lose his house, his cars. He's going to lose his credit. He's going to be out on the street. He's going to lose, maybe he's going to lose his family. He's not going to have anywhere to live. He's going to have to get food from someone else. He's going to have to get rent and heat from someone else. Sammy's life is about to be destroyed because of debt. Now remember what the Bible said. The borrower is the slave to the lender. The loans, the debts always come back to get you. Here's another way to look at how deep in the hole we are. I just tried to do some math in my own mind here to figure out how we could get out of this. Cutting spending, raising taxes, let's just do some simple math to see what it would take to get out of this. And there's one way we could do it is we have to cut spending by 36%. 36%, so more than a third of the spending of the federal government would need to be cut right away, and I'll show you for how long in a moment. You could do that, or the other way you could do it is you could cut spending, say by 16%, and raise taxes by 36%. The reason that's 36 is because you remember the amount of income taxes is only half. So you'd have to raise those income taxes by a proportionate amount more in order to balance out the spending cuts. So you could do either one of those, but you'd have to do that for 60 years to pay off this debt. 60 years. Now let me ask you a question. As you look at this, in our current political climate, is there any way on earth that our government is going to get together enough and recognize the problem and work together enough to cut spending and raise taxes and pay off this debt in 60 years? Now you see the problem. The problem is that Sammy has lost his mind. Sammy is in a car driving for the abyss and he just doesn't give a hoot. He's going for it, and whatever the costs are, the costs are. And that's really where we are as a nation. So here's what's going to happen. Let me lay out for you. If we continue on this path of borrowing all this money and loaning all this money and spending all this money and not paying off the debt, these are the steps of economic things that are going to happen in course of time if we don't turn around. Here's what's going to happen. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to start having to pay as a government. The government will have to start paying higher interest rates on its debt. Over time, as investors and as people who have money to loan start to realize the financial condition of the nation, they will start to want more interest in order to loan us money. So we will have to pay higher interest rates over time. And when the government pays higher interest rates on its bonds, all interest rates go off of that. So all interest rates will go up on car loans, on home mortgages, credit card. Everybody in the country will start to pay higher interest because of this, and that will slow the economy down because people will have to pay more interest and buy less stuff, whether it's a business or an individual. After we continue on the road and still adding up debt and not paying it off, we'll have fewer loans. People will be afraid to loan us money. There will be fewer loans that will be made, so people will simply pull out and they will say, the U.S. Treasury, the U.S. government is not a good risk. We need to put our money somewhere else. And so that will drive the rates even higher because the remaining investors will want more interest. And then because we can't borrow as much and we're having to pay more on interest on our debts that exist, we will have less money to spend. We will have to cut our spending because we simply won't have anybody to loan us money. So we'll have to cut spending and taxes in a very short period of time. If we keep going from there, fear will overtake. People will just get too afraid to give us any money. And we'll have no more lenders. And we'll have a cash shortfall, and there will be a panic. You've seen here, now you need to pay attention to what we've seen with this virus. How people start to panic even when reason doesn't justify it. That is what will happen when the federal government gets to the point where it can't get lenders. And when that happens, there'll be a global collapse. And you say, Wes, you're just being fear-mongering. I'm not fear-mongering. I'm not fear-mongering. If we keep going, think about Sammy. At some point, Sammy's going to go off the rails. And bad things are going to happen. Fearful things are going to happen to Sammy because he's not being wise. He is not following what the Bible says to do. So that's the verse that we've looked at here first. The borrower is servant, slave to the lender. At some point, this debt that is being driven to new heights by this stimulus is going to enslave us all. It's an economic and a biblical fact, a biblical truth that is going to burn us. But what I want to do now just for a moment is I want to step back. I want to ask, what's the bigger picture? What is God doing here in this situation? Let's look at the bigger picture. What is really going on? Here's our second text. Jeremiah 48. Since you trust in your deeds and riches, you too will be taken captive. So my heart laments for Moab like a flute. The wealth they acquired is gone. So in Jeremiah, God is not only the judge of Israel, God is the judge of all the nations, all the gathered groups of people. God is still their ruler. He's their creator and he's their ruler. And Moab was a nation that God was bringing judgment upon. And one of the ways that he was bringing that judgment is he was taking their wealth. He was taking their prosperity. Now let me ask you, what are we seeing right now as we've gone through these slides? What are we seeing? Is not God taking our wealth? Think about it. He's shut down the entire economy. He's brought it to a screeching halt. He's brought this virus around. He's allowed us to become so fearful. We've shut down the entire economy because of it. And behind it, we have to see the hand of God. He is shutting our economy down. And then he's also allowing us to increase this debt. He's saying, go ahead. I'm not going to give you wisdom. You've rejected me. This is part of my judgment. Here you go. How about this? Increase your debt. 200 years of debt in 9 months. So, if we see that the wealth they acquired is gone here in this judgment, we must conclude the same thing from the text, that the reason God is bringing this judgment upon us and taking our wealth is because we have become trusting in our deeds and our riches. We have idols, and the idol is our wealth. And under this idol, we have hidden so many sins. You see, we look out there and we see that we're prosperous. We see that the economy's doing great. We see that we've got 2 cars in every garage, and we go to the beach for 2 weeks, and we've got money aplenty. We go out to eat all the time. We've got all this money. And underneath that prosperity, we have all of this sin that we justify, and we think, hey, we're doing well, we're prosperous. There's either God doesn't care, God doesn't exist, or he's not going to do anything. So why not just do whatever we want? You see, we have come to trust in our deeds and our riches. And you can see this in the response to the stimulus. I saw it even among God's own people. Look at this here from the Washington Post. Dow swells nearly 500 points as Wall Street stretches stock rally into second day. A breakthrough on a $2 trillion stimulus package and backstops from the Federal Reserve elevate investors' outlook. You see, what we're doing is we're turning to the government. We have a crisis and we turn to the government. Instead of turning to God and saying, God, what are you doing here? And why are you doing this to us? And what is on your mind? We turn to the government and we turn right back to the wealth that is the problem anyway. And we go, our money will save us. Handed out by the wonderful, beautiful, wise, all-powerful federal government. Even God's own people, waiting for those checks, looking for those checks. Sigh of relief when the stimulus was passed. So we're like Dagon. You remember that, the story from the Old Testament where the Philistines had taken the ark and placed it in the temple of their god Dagon? And they came in the next morning and Dagon had fallen on his face flat. So they took Dagon and they put him back up. And the next morning they came back and he fell down flat and he was all broken to pieces. And finally they got the ark out of there. All right, this is what we're doing. God is knocking this idol down. He's saying government and money and all of this evil I'm knocking down. And what do? We turn right back to the idol. We set it right back up and we put our trust in it. You see, here is what is happening. God is bringing this judgment upon us. You call it what you want. I think the word judgment is a very fair word. He is bringing His judgment. He is punishing us. He is disciplining us for our idolatry and our evil. And He's placed before us this trial, this suffering, this discipline, which is right now the virus. But 10 years ago, it was the 2008 economic collapse. And then 10 years before that, it was 9/11. And 10 years before that, it was the first Gulf War. He has been disciplining us for years. And what we do, though, instead of yielding to this and being blessed by it, saying, God, what is it that you want? Repenting and turning, we sidestep. We take our resources, we take our money, and we try and fix the problem so that we don't have to endure the suffering. But the problem is, eventually, this suffering will not be avoidable. And what we're doing is, you see the picture here is of someone behind a set of bars. Remember what I told you about the servant of the slave of the lender? We're going to put ourselves in a much worse condition. Whereas now if we repented, now if we turned to God, now if we started to get our house in order financially, put away our idols of gold and silver, we have time to avoid a terrible calamity and catastrophe. But we're not going to do that. We're still going to worship our idol. And so down the road, there won't be any good end to this. There won't be anything but a total collapse. If we do not yield and repent now, we may survive this round of discipline. Things may get better. They may not totally collapse now. We may be able to sidestep this landmine right now. But eventually, we will be destroyed. This debt will take us down. It will be the end of the great nation that we have. And it all stems back to idolatry. My friends, we need to repent. We need to look God in the face. We need to recognize our sin and our foolishness and turn to Him before it is too late. I say this to the Christian community as well. So what I want to do next week is I want to begin talking about this issue on a little bit more of a deeper level. And I want to ask, why is God making America suffer? The reasons for divine crisis. I want to look at this issue and stare God in the face on this and try and understand from His Word and from our context what He's displeased with. Why is He bringing it on America? And we're going to roll that over into why is He bringing it on the churches in America? What is God trying to tell us through this? Why is He doing all of this to us? So I hope that you'll tune in for that next week. And also, if you would like to and you want to catch any of my other videos, you can check it out on Facebook or YouTube.